Before we journey into the wild forests and moonlit meadows where Artemis reigns supreme, let us first find our peace. Imagine yourself lying beneath an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching overhead like protective arms. The air is cool and carries the scent of pine needles and earth. Above you, the moon hangs full and luminous in a velvet sky scattered with countless stars. You can hear the gentle rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the soft whisper of wind moving through the wilderness. There is no danger here, only the eternal peace of nature in its purest form. Your breathing slows, becoming one with the rhythm of the forest around you. In this sacred space between waking and dreaming, you are safe, watched over by the goddess who knows every path through the woods, every creature that moves in shadow, every secret the wilderness holds. Let yourself sink deeper into this tranquil realm, for here, in this moment, you are under the protection of Artemis herself, the eternal guardian of wild places and wild hearts. And now, as you rest in this perfect stillness, let us begin our journey into her story. The birth of a goddess, origins and divine beginnings. The story of Artemis begins not in the civilized world of cities and temples, but in the chaos of divine jealousy and the desperation of a goddess in hiding. To understand Artemis, we must first understand where she came from, for her very birth shaped the fierce independence and protective nature that would define her throughout eternity. Leto, a Titan goddess of considerable beauty and grace, caught the wandering eye of Zeus, king of the Olympian gods. As was often the case with Zeus, his desires could not be constrained by his marriage to Hera, queen of the gods. When Leto became pregnant with Zeus's children, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Hera, whose jealousy was as legendary as Zeus's infidelity, unleashed her wrath not upon her husband, but upon his lover. In her fury, Hera issued a terrible decree that would echo across the ancient world. She forbade Leto from giving birth on any solid ground, on any place where the sun shone. The pregnant goddess was to wander, homeless and desperate, while the twins within her womb grew heavier with each passing day. Imagine the desperation of Leto as she traveled from place to place, seeking shelter, seeking rest, seeking any spot where she might safely deliver her divine children. Everywhere she went, the earth itself turned her away, fearful of incurring Hera's terrible vengeance. Mountains rejected her, plains refused her, islands floated away at her approach. The agony of her situation cannot be overstated. Here was a goddess carrying the children of the most powerful being in the cosmos, reduced to a wandering refugee with no place to call her own, no safe harbor where she could rest her weary body and bring forth the lives growing within her. It was only the floating island of Delos that finally took pity on Leto. Delos was not anchored to the sea floor, and therefore was not technically solid ground in the way Hera had defined it. This technicality, this loophole in divine law, became Leto's salvation. The island agreed to be her sanctuary, though it extracted a promise in return. Leto swore that one of her children would make Delos famous, would build a great temple there, and bring pilgrims from across the ancient world. Delos accepted this oath, and at last, after all her wandering and suffering, Leto had found a place to give birth. But even then, Hera's interference was not finished. She kept Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, detained on Mount Olympus, preventing her from coming to aid Leto in her hour of greatest need. For 9 days and 9 nights, Leto labored. 9 days and 9 nights of agony, of praying for relief, of calling out for the goddess who could ease her passage, but who was held captive by jealous Hera. The other goddesses, watching this torture, grew increasingly disturbed. Even among the often cruel Olympians, this seemed excessive. Finally, they sent Iris, the swift messenger goddess, with a bribe of a golden necklace to convince Eileithyia to slip away from Hera's watchful eye and come to Leto's aid. When Eileithyia at last arrived on Delos, the birth could finally proceed. And here is where the story takes a turn that would forever shape who Artemis would become. According to most accounts, Artemis was born first. She emerged from her mother's womb without complication. A relatively easy birth considering the circumstances, but her twin brother Apollo remained stuck, and Leto's suffering continued. The newborn Artemis, mere moments old, witnessed her mother's ongoing agony. Some versions of the myth say that Artemis, even as an infant goddess, immediately took on the role of midwife. She helped her mother through the difficult delivery of Apollo, guiding her brother into the world with her tiny divine hands. This moment, this experience of her mother's pain and her own role in easing it, would resonate through Artemis's entire existence. It planted in her the seeds of what she would become: a protector of women in childbirth, a defender of mothers, a goddess who understood suffering and took action to prevent it. From her very first moments of life, Artemis was already developing the fierce, protective instincts that would define her. The birth of the divine twins caused Delos to bloom with golden flowers, and 4 sacred swans circled the island 7 times. The island itself, previously barren and rocky, became a place of pilgrimage and wonder. Leto's promise was kept, and Delos would indeed become famous throughout the ancient world as the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis. But while Apollo would grow to become associated with civilization, with music and prophecy, and the ordered arts of humanity, Artemis took a different path from the very beginning. Where Apollo was drawn to cities and temples and the company of mortals, Artemis was drawn to the wild places, the forests and mountains where humans rarely ventured. Where Apollo sought to bring light and reason to the world, Artemis embraced the mystery and danger of untamed nature. The relationship between the twins was complex and deep. They shared a fierce loyalty to their mother Leto, and together they would defend her honor against any who dared insult her. They shared certain attributes as well. Both were master archers. Both were associated with sudden death. Both could bring plague or cure it, depending on their mood. But where Apollo's arrows brought death to men and boys, Artemis's arrows brought death to women and girls. This parallel between the twins extended throughout their mythology, creating a kind of divine balance in their shared functions. Yet despite these similarities, Artemis and Apollo were fundamentally different in temperament and desire. According to the poet Callimachus, when Artemis was still a young child, perhaps only 3 years old in divine terms, she approached her father Zeus with a series of requests. This scene, preserved in his Hymn to Artemis, reveals much about the goddess's character even at such a tender age. Sitting on Zeus's knee, the child goddess made her wishes known with startling clarity and determination. She asked for eternal virginity, requesting that she never be forced into marriage. She asked for a bow and arrows like her brothers. She asked for a tunic short enough to run in, practical rather than decorative. She asked for 60 young nymphs to be her companions, and 20 more to tend her hunting dogs, and care for her equipment when she was not hunting. She asked to be the light bringer, the one who would help women in childbirth. She asked for all the mountains of the world as her domain, and just one city. Any city, for she said she would rarely visit them. She would live in the mountains instead, among the wild creatures and the lonely peaks. Zeus, delighted by his daughter's boldness and charmed by her certainty about what she wanted, granted every request. And so Artemis, from childhood, was set on the path that would make her one of the most distinctive and independent deities in the Greek pantheon. She was not defined by a husband or a father, not contained within the domestic sphere, not subject to the authority of mortal men or the expectations of society. She was, from the very beginning, entirely her own. This divine childhood shaped everything that would follow. Artemis learned to shoot her bow with a devastating accuracy, practicing on trees at first, then on wild animals, and eventually on those who would dare to threaten her mother, or her sacred principles. She gathered her retinue of nymphs, young women who, like their goddess, chose a life of independence and the hunt over marriage and domesticity. She roamed the mountains and forests, learning every trail, every hidden spring, every secret dell where deer came to drink. She became intimately familiar with the rhythms of wild nature, with the patterns of animal behavior, with the silent language of the wilderness. But Artemis's childhood was not all peaceful hunts and mountain rambles. She and Apollo, even as young gods, were fierce in their mother's defense. When the giant Tityos tried to rape Leto, the twin gods shot him down with their arrows, and Zeus consigned him to eternal punishment in Tartarus. When the serpent Python pursued their mother, they tracked it down and killed it. This pattern would repeat throughout their lives. Anyone who threatened or insulted Leto were to face the terrible vengeance of her twin children. This fierce protectiveness, this readiness to unleash violence in defense of those they loved, was a core part of Artemis's nature. She was not a gentle goddess, not a mild or forgiving deity. She was wild in the truest sense, beautiful and deadly, nurturing and destructive, capable of immense kindness and terrible cruelty, depending on whether you honored or offended her. As Artemis grew from divine child to full goddess, her reputation spread. Hunters sought her blessing before venturing into the forests. Women in difficult labor prayed for her assistance. Young girls worshipped her as a model of strength and independence. She became known by many names and epithets: Potnia Theron, mistress of wild animals; Elaphebulos, deer shooter; Argotera of the hunt; Phoebe the bright one. Each name captured a different facet of her divine nature, a different aspect of her power and purpose. But through all these roles and titles, one thing remained constant. Artemis was fundamentally free. She belonged to no one, answered to no authority, except her own conscience and her father Zeus, and lived according to her own rules. This freedom, this sovereignty over her own life and choices, was sacred to her, and, as we shall see, she would defend it with every arrow in her quiver. The sacred virginity, symbol of independence and power. To understand Artemis, one must understand what virginity meant in the ancient Greek world, and what it meant specifically to this goddess. who made it the cornerstone of her identity. This is not simply a matter of sexual purity in the modern sense. When Artemis vowed to remain a virgin, when she demanded eternal maidenhood from Zeus, she was claiming something far more profound and political than mere abstinence. She was claiming autonomy. In ancient Greek society, a woman's life followed a predetermined path. She would be born into her father's household, under his authority. She would be given in marriage to a husband chosen by her father, and she would pass from her father's authority to her husband's authority. She would bear children, manage a household, and live her entire existence under male supervision and control. A married woman, by the very definition of marriage in that culture, was subservient. She belonged first to her father, then to her husband. Her body was not her own. Her choices were not her own. Her life was not her own. Virginity, or more accurately, the unmarried state, was the only period in an ancient Greek woman's life when she possessed any measure of independence. A Parthenos, a maiden, existed in a liminal space between childhood and wifely subjugation. She was not yet bound to a man. She had not yet surrendered her autonomy. Of course, this state was meant to be temporary, a brief interlude before the inevitable transition to marriage and motherhood. But Artemis said no. She looked at this system, this inevitability, this expectation that all females must eventually submit to male authority, and she rejected it utterly and eternally. When she demanded eternal virginity from Zeus, she was demanding eternal autonomy. She was claiming the right to belong to herself, to make her own choices, to live free from male authority and male ownership. She was, in effect, claiming equality with the male gods, asserting that she had the power and the right to determine her own existence. This was revolutionary. Zeus's granting of her request was perhaps one of his most progressive acts as king of the gods. By allowing Artemis to remain a virgin forever, he was acknowledging her right to self-determination. He was placing her outside normal social order, creating a space where she could exist as a fully independent being, answerable to no one, subject to no one's control or ownership. But Artemis's virginity was not simply about rejecting male authority. It was also about power, specifically the concentration and retention of power. In ancient Greek thought, sexual activity dispersed vital energy. This belief was particularly strong regarding hunters, who traditionally abstained from sex before a hunt to maintain their ritual purity and their physical prowess. The ancient Greeks believed that sexual activity carried a scent that would warn away prey. But more than that, they believed it diminished one's focus, one's strength, one's connection to the primal energies required for successful hunting. Artemis, as the ultimate huntress, embodied this principle to its extreme. Her virginity was a form of concentrated power, a retention of vital force that made her the most deadly and effective hunter in existence. She was pure predatory energy, undiluted by the complexities and vulnerabilities that came with sexual and romantic relationships. This purity made her arrows fly truer, her aim more deadly, her connection to wild nature more profound. Moreover, there's a fascinating paradox in Artemis's virginity. Though she herself never bore children, she was intimately connected with fertility and childbirth. Her virginity was not sterility. Rather, it was a concentration of fertile potential that she could bestow upon her followers and those who honored her. like a spring that never runs dry because its waters are not diverted into many channels. Artemis's perpetual maidenhood meant that her power to bless others with children, to protect women in labor, to nurture young life remained at full strength always. Some scholars have suggested that Artemis represents an echo of earlier mother goddess figures whose power came from their control over fertility rather than from their participation in it. These ancient goddesses did not need male consorts because they were themselves the source of life, not merely vessels for male seed. Artemis, in her virgin state, may be carrying forward this archaic conception of female divine power, complete, sufficient unto itself, requiring no male counterpart to be whole and potent. The goddess's insistence on virginity extended beyond herself to her followers. The nymphs who attended Artemis, who hunted with her and traveled with her through the wilderness, were required to maintain their virginity as well. This was not arbitrary cruelty or possessive control. Rather, it was about maintaining the unity of the sisterhood. If a nymph married, she would leave the wild band of hunters and enter into domestic life. She would no longer be free to roam the mountains and forests. She would belong to her husband, answer to his authority, and abandon the independence that defined life in Artemis's retinue. This requirement had teeth. Artemis was swift and merciless with nymphs who broke their vows. The story of Callisto, which we will explore in greater depth later, illustrates this dramatically. When Callisto was seduced, or more accurately, raped by Zeus, Artemis did not show mercy or understanding. She transformed Callisto into a bear, stripping away her human form and casting her out from the company of nymphs. This seems harsh to modern sensibilities, particularly given that Callisto was a victim rather than a willing participant in breaking her vow. But from Artemis's perspective, the violation of virginity, regardless of the circumstances, meant that Callisto could no longer be part of the sacred band of huntresses. The loss of virginity meant the loss of that particular kind of freedom and power that the group embodied. Yet, we must be careful not to interpret Artemis's virginity as asexuality or as a rejection of physicality. Artemis was intensely physical. She ran, she hunted, she danced with her nymphs in moonlit clearings. She bathed in cold mountain streams. She knew the feeling of her bow's tension and the thrill of a successful hunt. Her body was not denied or suppressed. Rather, it was celebrated in ways that had nothing to do with sexuality or male desire. She was not a disembodied spirit or an ascetic rejecting worldly pleasure. She was fully embodied, fully alive, fully engaged with the physical world, but on her own terms. The ancient Greeks sometimes depicted Artemis as beautiful beyond measure, and many mortals and gods desired her. But she rejected all advances, sometimes with terrible consequences for those who persisted. Her beauty was not meant for male consumption or possession. It simply was, belonging to her alone, a fact of her divine nature that had nothing to do with attracting or pleasing men. This was deeply subversive in a culture where women's beauty was typically valued primarily in terms of its effect on men and its potential to secure a beneficial marriage. Artemis's virginity also needs to be understood in contrast to Aphrodite, the goddess of sexual love and desire. Where Aphrodite represented the power of sexuality and attraction, Artemis represented the power of its absence or transcendence. Together, they encompassed the full range of female experience and power. Aphrodite showing that there was power in embracing sexuality, Artemis showing that there was power in rejecting it. Neither was complete without the other. Together, they demonstrated that women's power could take many forms and was not dependent on any single relationship to sexuality or reproduction. In refusing marriage and sexual relationships, Artemis was also refusing vulnerability. Love and desire make one vulnerable. They give others power over you, create dependencies, forge chains that bind even as they connect. Artemis, in her virgin state, remained invulnerable in this crucial way. She could not be manipulated through sexual desire. She could not be controlled through threats to a lover or children. She could not be undermined through the complications and compromises that romantic relationships inevitably entail. She remained purely herself, uncompromised, uncontrolled, untouchable. This is not to say that Artemis was incapable of affection or connection. She loved her mother Leto fiercely. She was devoted to her twin brother Apollo, despite their differences. She cared deeply for her nymphs and protected them with ferocious dedication. She showed favor to certain mortals who honored her and won her respect. But these relationships were all on her terms, chosen by her, defined by her, and maintained according to her standards. They did not diminish her power or compromise her autonomy. The three virgin goddesses of the Greek pantheon, Artemis, Athena, and Hestia, represented three different expressions of female independence. Hestia's virginity was quiet and domestic, focused on the sacred fire of the hearth. Athena's virginity was intellectual and martial, focused on wisdom and strategic warfare. Artemis's virginity was wild and untamed, focused on nature and the hunt. Together, they demonstrated that women's power and presence did not require male validation or participation, that there were forms of female existence that were complete and powerful unto themselves. Artemis's eternal maidenhood was her declaration of independence, her refusal to be defined by relationship with men, her claim to sovereignty over her own body and life. It was both symbol and substance of her power, and she guarded it absolutely, without mercy or exception. Those who threatened her virginity, who tried to violate it or compromise it, faced her terrible wrath. The hunter Actaeon, who accidentally saw her naked while she bathed, was transformed into a stag and torn apart by his own hounds. The giant Orion, in some versions of the myth, met his death for attempting to assault her or one of her nymphs. The message was crystal clear. Artemis belonged to herself alone, and any attempt to claim her, own her, or violate her boundaries would be met with swift and devastating punishment. In this way, Artemis's virginity was not passive or defensive. It was active, aggressive, fiercely protected, and fiercely proclaimed. It was not about hiding from sexuality or fleeing from desire. It was about claiming a form of power and freedom that transcended those things, that existed in a realm where she was complete unto herself, where she needed nothing and no one to define or complete her. She was, in the deepest sense, autonomous, a law unto herself, a power unto herself, a being whose existence was justified by nothing more than her own divine will. This is what made Artemis such a potent symbol in the ancient world and why she continues to resonate today. She represented the possibility of female existence outside the constraints of patriarchal society. She showed that a woman could be powerful, complete, and valuable without reference to her husband or father. without children or domestic role. She proved that independence was not just possible, but could be a source of tremendous strength and authority. Queen of the hunt and the wilderness. If virginity defined Artemis's relationship with human society, it was the hunt that defined her relationship with nature. This was her domain, her realm, her truest home. While her brother Apollo might claim lordship over civilized arts and ordered institutions, Artemis ruled the wild places where humanity's carefully constructed boundaries dissolved into something older, more primal, more true. To understand Artemis as huntress, we must first understand that Mistress of Wild Animals was not simply a title, but her most ancient and perhaps most essential identity. The Greeks called her Potnia Theron, and archaeological evidence suggests this role predates even the Olympian pantheon itself. Images from the Bronze Age show a goddess, often flanked by lions or holding serpents, who seems to embody the power of untamed nature. This figure evolved and merged with other local goddesses over centuries, eventually crystallizing into the Artemis the classical Greeks worshipped. As Potnia Theron, Artemis held paradoxical sway over the animal kingdom. She was both the protector of wild creatures and their hunter. She nurtured young animals, ensuring does had strong fawns and wolf mothers had healthy cubs. Yet she also pursued and killed those same creatures with her unerring arrows. This contradiction is not a flaw in the mythology, but rather reflects a sophisticated understanding of nature's balance. Artemis represented the entire cycle of predation and survival, of death and renewal, that governs wild places. She was not sentimental about animals in the modern sense. She understood that death was part of life, that the hunter and the hunted were partners in an eternal dance, that nature's mercy and nature's cruelty were two faces of the same divine power. The young of wild animals held special significance for Artemis. She protected them, watched over them, became furious if they were harmed unnecessarily. In one famous myth from Brauron, a bear that was sacred to Artemis was killed after it scratched a young girl. The goddess sent a plague upon the region, demanding that young girls perform a ritual called the Archetype, acting as bears themselves, to atone for the death of her sacred animal. This protective impulse toward the young and vulnerable extended beyond animals to human children, particularly girls, making her simultaneously a goddess of savage wilderness and of civilization's most innocent members. Artemis's weapons were as iconic as the goddess herself. Her bow was described as golden or silver, depending on the source, fashioned for her by either Hephaestus or the Cyclopes, who also created Zeus's thunderbolts. Her arrows were said to be unerring, flying straight to their mark with supernatural precision. She carried a quiver that never emptied, each arrow precisely suited to its purpose. Some brought swift death, others brought lingering disease. Some struck down the proud, others pierced the hearts of the wicked. Unlike mortal hunters who might wound an animal and have it escape, to die slowly and painfully, Artemis's arrows killed cleanly, efficiently, respecting the life even as she took it. The deer was perhaps Artemis's most sacred animal. The gentle doe and the proud stag appeared repeatedly in her myths and iconography. Her chariot was sometimes said to be drawn by 4 golden-horned deer that were themselves immortal and under her protection. Yet she also hunted deer, pursuing them through forests and across mountains with a hunter's keen joy. This seeming contradiction again reflects the deep truth that Artemis represented all aspects of the hunt, all facets of the relationship between predator and prey. The deer was sacred to her not despite being hunted, but because of it. The pursuit itself was holy. The chase was a form of worship. The moment when arrow met flesh was a moment of divine communion. The bear was another animal intimately connected with Artemis, particularly in her aspect as protector of young girls. The Arctia ceremony at Brauron required girls between the ages of 5 and 10 to wear saffron robes and act the bear as part of their transition toward womanhood. Bears were seen as fierce mothers, protective and dangerous when their cubs were threatened. And this maternal fierceness resonated with Artemis's own fierce protectiveness toward those under her care. Some scholars suggest that very ancient forms of Artemis worship may have involved an actual cult of a bear goddess that was later incorporated into the Olympian goddess's mythology. Hunting dogs were constant companions of Artemis. She was said to have acquired her original pack from the god Pan, who gave her 7 female hounds that were swift enough to catch living prey, and 3 males who could pull down lions. Their names were recorded with care. Dogs like Sirius, Lynceus, and Hecate, who hunted alongside their goddess through every forest and mountain range in the ancient world. These were not merely animals, but companions, partners in the hunt, valued for their skill and loyalty. When Artemis's dogs appear in myths, they are often the executors of her will, as when Actaeon's own hounds turn on him and tear him apart. The goddess's connection to dogs underscored her role as ultimate hunter. She commanded the animals humans themselves had domesticated and trained for the hunt. The wilderness itself was Artemis's domain, in the most complete sense. She knew every mountain peak, every hidden valley, every secret grove throughout Greece. Specific locations became sacred to her. Groves of ancient trees where altars were built, springs where her nymphs bathed, meadows where deer came to graze under her watchful eye. These places existed at the margins of human civilization, at the boundaries where farmland and city gave way to forest and mountain, where human order dissolved into natural chaos. Unlike Apollo, who moved comfortably between Olympus, Delphi, and the cities of men, Artemis was fundamentally uncomfortable in civilized spaces. She visited towns and cities only when necessary, preferring the company of wild animals and her nymph companions to that of mortals. This was not misanthropy exactly, but rather a preference for authenticity. In the wilderness, everything was exactly what it appeared to be. A wolf was a wolf. A deer was a deer. A mountain was a mountain. There were no pretenses, no lies, no elaborate social constructions masking brutal realities. The wilderness was honest in a way that civilization could never be, and Artemis was drawn to that honesty. When mortals entered Artemis's wilderness, they did so at their own risk. The forests and mountains were not theme parks or recreational areas. In the ancient conception, they were dangerous places, full of threats, governed by laws entirely different from those of civilization. Humans who ventured into the wild entered Artemis's realm and were subject to her rules. Hunters had to approach with proper respect, making offerings and prayers before taking game. Travelers had to be wary, watching for signs of the goddess's presence and favor. Those who showed arrogance or disrespect might find themselves lost in trackless woods or worse, might encounter Artemis herself in one of her wrathful moods. Artemis hunted by night as well as by day, and her association with the moon grew stronger over time until she became almost inseparable from it. The moon's changeable nature, waxing and waning, appearing and disappearing, constant yet ever-changing, resonated with Artemis's own multifaceted identity. As moon goddess, she illuminated the nighttime wilderness, allowing her hunts to continue after sunset, when many of the most elusive prey emerged from hiding. The moon's light was her light, cold and silver, transforming the forest into a place of shadows and secrets. The hunts themselves were described in poetry and art as moments of transcendent beauty and terror. Artemis running through the forest, her short tunic allowing freedom of movement, her bow in hand and her hounds racing ahead, her nymphs running alongside her, equally fierce, equally skilled. The sound of the horn, the baying of hounds, the flight of arrows, the final confrontation between hunter and prey. These were not simply practical expeditions to acquire meat, but rather rituals, performances, enactments of fundamental cosmic truths about predation and survival, death and renewal. But Artemis's relationship with the hunt went deeper than mere skill, or even divine authority. She represented the hunter's mindset, the psychological state that successful hunting required. This required focus, patience, the ability to remain absolutely still for hours, waiting for the right moment. It required understanding animal behavior, reading tracks and signs, knowing how to move through wilderness without disturbing it. It required respect for the prey, acknowledgement of its right to live even as you sought to kill it. It required confronting death directly, without sentimentality or denial, accepting your role in the great cycle of nature. Ancient hunters made offerings to Artemis before setting out, asking for her blessing on their hunts. These were not casual prayers, but serious invocations, acknowledging that they were entering her domain and seeking her permission to take life from the animal kingdom she protected. Successful hunts were celebrated with offerings of the first portion of meat, given back to the goddess in recognition that all game ultimately belonged to her. Failed hunts might be interpreted as signs of her disfavor, requiring additional offerings and purification before trying again. But Artemis was more than just the patron of hunters. She was the essence of wildness itself. She embodied everything that resisted domestication, control, civilization. She was the howl of wolves in the night, the rush of a waterfall in an unmapped mountain range, the sudden silence that falls in a forest when a predator passes by. She was beautiful and terrible, nurturing and deadly, life-giving and life-taking. To encounter Artemis in her aspect as mistress of wild animals was to encounter nature in its purest, most uncompromising form. This wildness made her dangerous, unpredictable, impossible to fully understand or control. Unlike Athena, whose wisdom was accessible to those who sought it properly, or Hera, whose favor could be won through appropriate offerings and devotion, Artemis remained fundamentally unknowable. She might grant favor for reasons mortals could not fathom, or withdraw it just as mysteriously. She might show mercy or cruelty with equal suddenness. She operated according to the logic of wild nature, not the logic of civilization, and those who forgot this difference did so at their peril. Yet despite, or perhaps because of, this danger, Artemis was deeply beloved. Hunters honored her with genuine devotion, Young girls looked to her as a model of strength and independence. Those who loved the wilderness recognized in her a kindred spirit. She offered freedom from the constraints and compromises of civilized life, a glimpse of something older and truer than human society. To worship Artemis was to acknowledge that there were powers and places that lay beyond human control, beyond human understanding, vast and wild and eternal. Swift and terrible vengeance, acts of divine retribution. If Artemis was beloved for her protection and admired for her hunting prowess, she was feared for her vengeance. The goddess of the wilderness did not forgive easily, and those who offended her discovered that her arrows flew as truly toward human targets as toward deer or boar. The myths are full of mortals who learned too late that Artemis was not a goddess to be crossed, that her boundaries were absolute, and that violation of those boundaries brought swift and terrible punishment. The tale of Actaeon stands as perhaps the most famous warning about the consequences of seeing what you should not see, of violating boundaries you should not cross. Actaeon was a skilled hunter, grandson of Cadmus, who founded Thebes, trained by the centaur Chiron himself in the arts of tracking and archery. He was accomplished, confident, and on one fateful day, supremely unlucky. Different versions of the story offer different details, but the core remains consistent. Actaeon was out hunting with his companions and his pack of hounds on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron. The hunt had been successful, and Actaeon's dogs had proven their worth. But at some point, Actaeon became separated from his hunting party. Perhaps he wandered off pursuing a particularly elusive deer, or perhaps he was simply exploring the wild terrain. Whatever the reason, his steps carried him to a hidden grotto, a secret valley where a spring fed a pool of crystal clear water. And there he found Artemis. The goddess had been hunting all morning and had retreated to this isolated spot to bathe, accompanied by her nymphs. She had removed her hunting tunic, laid aside her bow and arrows, and was refreshing herself in the cool waters. Her nymphs surrounded her, some assisting her, others bathing themselves, all of them vulnerable in their nakedness, believing themselves safely hidden in this remote place far from mortal eyes. When Actaeon stumbled upon this scene, time seemed to stop. He froze, transfixed by what he saw. According to Ovid's telling in the Metamorphoses, Actaeon was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. His intrusion was accidental, not deliberate. He had no malicious intent, no plan to spy on the goddess. He was simply a mortal who happened to push aside the wrong branch, take the wrong turn, and find himself face to face with divine nudity. But accidents meant nothing to Artemis. Intent meant nothing. The fact remained that he had seen her naked. He had violated her most sacred space, intruded upon her vulnerability, witnessed what no mortal man was meant to witness. The nymphs screamed and tried to shield their goddess with their own bodies, but Artemis stood taller than them all, even naked and unarmed, even surprised and violated. She was terrifying. Artemis had no arrows to hand, so she seized the only weapon available, water. She scooped it up from the pool and flung it in Actaeon's face. And as the drop struck him, she spoke words that sealed his doom. Now go tell, if you can, that you have seen me stripped of my clothes. If you can. Those words were not idle. Even as Artemis spoke them, Actaeon felt his body begin to change. His hearing grew sharp and his ears grew long, Ray say. His neck lengthened and his head transformed, sprouting antlers where his forehead had been. His arms became legs, his hands became hooves. His skin sprouted a dappled hide. Within moments, where a man had stood, there was now a stag. Not just any stag, but a magnificent example of the species, the kind of trophy any hunter would prize. The horror was complete when Actaeon realized his mind remained human. He was trapped inside an animal's body, unable to speak, unable to explain, unable to do anything except feel the rising panic and confusion. He tried to call out to his companions, but the only sound that emerged was the bleat of a frightened deer. And then he heard the sound that would haunt any hunter, the baying of hounds on the scent. His own dogs had picked up his trail. The irony was perfect and terrible. These were the hounds he had raised from puppies, trained to hunt, fed from his own hand. He knew each one by name, and now they were hunting him. Actaeon ran. His new body was swift and powerful, but the hounds were relentless. They'd been trained too well by him to let prey escape. Through the forest he fled, across streams and up mountain paths, but the pack was always behind him, always gaining, and finally, inevitably, they caught him. Different accounts describe what happened next with varying levels of detail, but all agree on the essential horror. The hounds attacked their master, tore into him with teeth meant for deer and boar, pulled him down and ripped him apart. Actaeon died slowly, in agony, fully conscious of what was happening, unable to cry out for help or mercy. His hunting party heard the commotion and came running, thinking Actaeon had cornered particularly large game. By the time they arrived, there was nothing left but blood and scattered remains. The transformation of Actaeon served multiple symbolic purposes. On one level, it was pure punishment. He had seen Artemis in a state of vulnerability, so he would die in the most vulnerable way imaginable, killed by his own faithful companions. On another level, it was a kind of divine irony. The hunter became the hunted, experiencing from the prey's perspective what he had inflicted countless times before. The man who had specialized in tracking and killing deer became a deer himself, subject to the same terror and the same violent end. But perhaps most significantly, Actaeon's fate served as a warning about boundaries. Artemis's virginity, her autonomy, her control over who saw her body and when. These were absolute boundaries that could not be crossed even by accident. The fact that Actaeon meant no harm, that he was guilty only of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, made no difference. The boundary existed. He crossed it. He paid the price. The story of Callisto presents a different kind of boundary violation and a different kind of punishment, though equally devastating. Callisto was one of Artemis's favorite nymphs, a companion who hunted alongside the goddess through countless forests and mountains. She was beautiful, skilled, devoted to Artemis and to her vow of virginity. But beauty, as so often in Greek mythology, attracted unwanted attention from the most powerful and dangerous quarter imaginable, Zeus himself. Zeus, king of the gods and notorious philanderer, saw Callisto hunting in the forest one day and desired her. But he faced a problem. Callisto was committed to her vow of chastity and would not willingly submit to him. Moreover, she was constantly surrounded by other nymphs and by Artemis herself, making a straightforward seduction impossible. So, Zeus, with the moral flexibility typical of the Olympians, devised a deception. He disguised himself as Artemis. Imagine Callisto's confusion when her beloved goddess approached her in the forest. She saw what appeared to be Artemis's face, heard what sounded like Artemis's voice, felt what seemed to be Artemis's presence. How could she suspect deception when the false Artemis asked her to step away from the other nymphs, to come speak privately? Callisto obeyed without question, and in that moment of isolation, Zeus revealed his true form and raped her. The assault left Callisto devastated, ashamed, terrified. She tried to hide what had happened, tried to continue as before, as if she could somehow pretend the violation had not occurred. But Zeus's seed had taken root, and inevitably, her pregnancy began to show. For months she managed to conceal it, wearing looser garments, positioning herself strategically among her sister nymphs, avoiding situations where her changing body would be obvious. But finally came the day when Artemis, hot and tired from hunting, called her nymphs to bathe in a secluded pool. There was no refusing such an invitation, no way to avoid removing her clothes. And when Callisto's swollen belly was revealed, the secret came out in the worst possible way. Artemis's rage was immediate and absolute. There was no hearing of explanations, no consideration of circumstances, no mercy for the fact that Callisto had been an unwilling victim. All Artemis saw was the broken vow, the violated pledge, the betrayal of everything the band of huntresses represented. In some versions of the myth, Artemis herself transformed Callisto into a bear on the spot. In others, the transformation came later, at Hera's instigation, with Artemis either participating or standing aside. Either way, Callisto found herself suddenly trapped in an animal's body, not a swift deer or a proud stag, but a lumbering bear, feared and hunted by humans. Unable to speak or explain or plead her case, she was expelled from Artemis's company, forced to wander alone in the very forest where she had once hunted. Every crack of a twig, every sound of approaching footsteps filled her with terror that hunters would find her, that she would be killed for sport or out of fear. She gave birth while in bear form, and in most versions, her son Arcas was taken from her almost immediately, raised by others with no knowledge of his mother's identity or fate. For years she wandered, neither fully bear nor fully human, her mind trapped and tormented, watching her son from a distance as he grew to manhood. The final tragedy came when Arcas, now grown and an accomplished hunter himself, encountered a bear in the forest. He raised his spear, not knowing he was about to kill his own mother. At the last moment, Zeus intervened, placing both Callisto and Arcas in the heavens as constellations, Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, the Great Bear and the Little Bear. But even this apparent mercy came with a final cruelty, courtesy of jealous Hera, who convinced the ocean gods to curse the constellations never to dip below the horizon, never to rest in the sea's waters. They circle the northern sky eternally, forever separated from peace, forever marked by their suffering. Callisto's story reveals Artemis at her least merciful. Unlike Actaeon, who arguably violated the goddess's privacy through his own actions, Callisto was a victim. She did not choose to break her vow. She did not willingly engage in sexual activity. She was raped by Zeus, the most powerful being in the cosmos, using deception that exploited her trust in her goddess. Yet Artemis showed no understanding, no compassion, no recognition of these mitigating circumstances. The vow was broken, and that was all that mattered. Some interpret this harshness as evidence of Artemis's rigid, unbending nature. She set rules and enforced them absolutely, with no consideration for context or intent. Others see it as a reflection of ancient Greek attitudes toward violated women, who were often blamed and punished regardless of whether the violation was their fault. Still, others suggest that Artemis's anger may have been directed partly at Zeus for his violation, but since she could not punish the king of the gods, she punished his victim instead. A deeply unjust but sadly common displacement of rage, but perhaps the darkest interpretation is that Artemis could not bear to be reminded of the vulnerability of female bodies in a world ruled by male power. Callisto's rape, accomplished through a disguise that exploited Callisto's love for and trust in Artemis, was in some sense a violation of Artemis herself. Zeus had literally taken on her form to commit his crime by transforming Callisto and casting her out. Artemis was perhaps trying to erase this reminder, to remove from her presence the evidence that even her protection was not enough, that even her sacred band of virgin huntresses was vulnerable to male violence. The story of Niobe presents a different kind of offense, not violation of Artemis's person or her followers, but rather insult to her mother Leto. And here we see Artemis in her aspect, as fierce defender of family, working in concert with her twin brother Apollo to exact revenge that would echo through the ages as a warning about the dangers of hubris. Niobe was queen of Thebes, married to King Amphion, and, most importantly, mother to 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters. By any reasonable measure, she was blessed. Her children were healthy, beautiful, accomplished. Her position was secure. She should have been content, grateful for her good fortune, humble before the gods, who had granted her such abundance. But Niobe was not humble. During a festival honoring Leto, when the people of Thebes were making offerings and prayers to the mother of Apollo and Artemis, Niobe stood up and made a speech that sealed her family's doom. Why, she demanded, were they honoring Leto? What had Leto done that was so special? She had borne 2 children. 2. Niobe herself had borne 14. Leto's children were mere gods, while Niobe's children were real, present, beautiful, mortal offspring who brought honor to Thebes. By any measure, Niobe declared, she was superior to Leto. She was the greater mother. The people should be making offerings to her instead. The hubris was breathtaking. To claim superiority over a goddess, to mock a titan in her own temple, to publicly insult Leto during ceremonies meant to honor her. This was asking for divine retribution. And Leto, hearing of the insult, went to her children. She did not need to ask them to act. Apollo and Artemis were immediately inflamed with righteous rage on their mother's behalf. No one insulted Leto in their hearing. No one questioned her worth, her glory, her superiority to any mortal, no matter how privileged. The twin gods took up their bows and descended upon Thebes like a plague. Apollo went first. He found Niobe's 7 sons in the fields outside the city, engaging in athletic exercises. They were training with horses, practicing with javelins, wrestling and running. They were young, strong, vital, the pride of their mother's heart. Apollo's arrows found them one by one. The first arrow struck the eldest son as he rode his horse, and he fell lifeless to the ground. The second son tried to flee, but an arrow pierced his back. The third tried to plead for mercy, but Apollo's arrow was already in flight, striking him mid-plea. One by one, methodically, Apollo shot down every one of Niobe's sons, while their mother watched. This detail is crucial. The myths specify that Niobe witnessed the slaughter, saw her boys falling one after another, their bodies piling up in the field where they had been so recently alive and laughing. She tried to run to them, tried to shield the younger ones with her own body, but mortal flesh offered no protection against divine arrows. Her pleas, her screams, her desperate promises to take back everything she had said, none of it mattered. Apollo continued until all 7 sons lay dead, and then came Artemis. The daughters had been in the palace, attending to various activities, some weaving, some singing, some simply talking among themselves. They heard the commotion outside, heard the screams, and gathered near the windows trying to see what was happening. Their mother rushed in, wild with grief, trying to gather them close, trying somehow to protect them, but there was no protection. Artemis's arrows came through the windows, found their targets with supernatural precision. The first daughter fell clutching at the arrow in her chest. The second tried to help her sister, and was struck down as well. The third fled toward the inner rooms of the palace, but Artemis's arrow found her even there. The fourth, fifth, and sixth fell in quick succession. Only the youngest remained, crouching in her mother's arms, both of them praying desperately for mercy. But mercy did not come. Or perhaps it did. Some versions suggest Artemis spared the youngest daughter, though this mercy seems almost crueler, leaving one child alive to share her mother's grief. Most versions, though, have Artemis's final arrow completing the slaughter, striking down the last of Niobe's children, while the girl's arms were still wrapped around her mother. Niobe's husband, Amphion, unable to bear the loss of all his children, fell on his own sword and died. Or, in some versions, Apollo struck him down as well when he tried to attack the temples in his rage and grief. Either way, Niobe was left alone, surrounded by 14 bodies, her entire family destroyed in a matter of hours, because she had spoken words of pride and comparison. The gods, perhaps taking pity on the devastated Thebans, turned all the people of the city to stone temporarily, so no one could bury the dead. For 9 days the bodies lay, exposed, bloating in the sun, food for scavengers. Only on the 10th day did the gods themselves finally bury the children. By then, Niobe had fled back to her childhood home of Mount Sipylus, barely coherent with grief. And there, on the mountain, she was transformed into stone, but even as a rock, she wept. The tears continued to flow, carving channels down the stone face, creating streams and waterfalls. To this day, locals will point out rock formations on Mount Sipylus that are said to be Niobe still weeping for her children. Her grief so profound that even transformation into lifeless stone could not end it. Artemis's role in this massacre reveals her as implacable when defending her family's honor. There was no negotiation, no graduated punishment, no warning shots. Niobe spoke words of hubris, and the punishment was total annihilation of everything she held dear. The swiftness and completeness of the retribution made it clear that while Artemis might show mercy to those who honored her and her family, she would show absolutely none to those who insulted them. These 3 stories, Actaeon, Callisto, and Niobe, represent different facets of Artemis's capacity for vengeance. Actaeon violated her physical boundaries and privacy. Callisto violated the sacred vow of virginity that defined the band of hunters. Niobe insulted Artemis's mother and claimed superiority to a goddess. Each offense brought swift, terrible, and disproportionate punishment by modern standards. Yet, we must understand that ancient Greeks did not see these punishments as excessive. The gods operated on a different scale than mortals, with different priorities and different values. Artemis's swift retribution was not cruelty, but rather divine justice, maintaining proper boundaries between gods and mortals, between sacred and profane, between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. Her vengeance served as warning and teaching. These are the boundaries. These are the consequences. Do not forget. Asia, Love and Loss, the tale of Orion. Among all the myths of Artemis, one stands apart for its poignancy and tragedy. The story of Orion, the only mortal who may have won the virgin goddess's heart. This tale, told in multiple conflicting versions, suggests that even Artemis, who had sworn eternal maidenhood, who had rejected countless suitors, both divine and mortal, who seemed utterly immune to the vulnerabilities of love, was not entirely invulnerable to its power. And, in the end, that vulnerability led to loss that haunted her forever. Orion himself was no ordinary mortal. He was a giant, son of Poseidon in most accounts, granted the ability to walk upon water as easily as upon land. He was extraordinarily handsome, with physical prowess that rivaled the gods themselves. But what made Orion truly exceptional was his skill as a hunter. He could track any creature, bring down any prey, navigate any wilderness. He was, in essence, the mortal equivalent of what Artemis represented among the gods, the perfect hunter, the master of the wild, the one who moved through nature with supernatural grace and competence. How they met varies by telling. Some say Orion came to Crete where Artemis was hunting, and they encountered each other in the pursuit of the same magnificent stag. Others say he sought her out deliberately, having heard of her legendary hunting prowess, and wishing to test his skills against hers. Still others suggest their meeting was orchestrated by the gods, perhaps even by Apollo, though for purposes that became clear only later. What remains consistent across versions is that when Artemis and Orion met, they recognized in each other kindred spirits. And here was someone who understood the hunt not as mere sport or necessity, but as something deeper, almost spiritual. Someone who could move through forests without disturbing them, who could read animal signs as easily as scholars read texts, who felt most alive in wild places far from civilization, someone who needed no explanation for why the wilderness called so powerfully, who required no justification for preferring the company of animals to that of humans. They began to hunt together. Picture them side by side, Artemis in her short tunic with her silver bow, Orion with his massive frame and supernatural strength, both pursuing prey through the mountains and forests of ancient Greece. Their skill complemented each other perfectly. Where Artemis was precise and controlled, Orion was powerful and bold. Where she moved with divine grace, he moved with mortal determination and grit. Together they were unstoppable, bringing down creatures that neither could have taken alone. Artemis's nymphs watched this development with unease. Their goddess had never spent so much time with a man before, never seemed so comfortable in male company, never laughed so readily, or shared her knowledge so freely. Orion was integrated into their hunting parties, trusted with their secret paths and sacred groves, It was unprecedented and unsettling. But what truly alarmed the nymphs and eventually came to Apollo's attention was the way Artemis looked at Orion. There was something in her eyes when she watched him bring down a charging boar, or heard him laugh after a successful hunt, or saw him emerge from a river with water streaming from his massive shoulders. It was not merely friendship or respect. It was not simply the pleasure of finding a worthy hunting companion. It was something warmer, something dangerous, something that threatened the very foundation of Artemis's identity as the eternal virgin. Different versions of the myth offer different explanations for what happened next, but all share a common element. Orion's death came about through some combination of hubris, divine jealousy, and tragic misunderstanding. In one version, Orion became intoxicated with his own success, hunting alongside a goddess, bringing down prey that would challenge any mortal hunter. He began to boast. He declared that he would hunt down and kill every beast on earth, that no creature could escape his skill, that he would cleanse the world of all wild animals. This boast reached the ears of Gaia, the primordial earth herself, mother of all living things. Enraged at this threat to her children, she sent forth a creature that could not be defeated, a gigantic scorpion with armor that no arrow could pierce, and a stinger that delivered instant death. The battle between Orion and the scorpion was epic, but ultimately futile. No matter how many times Orion struck at the creature, his blows could not penetrate its shell. No matter how he tried to evade its attacks, the scorpion pursued him relentlessly. Finally, inevitably, the scorpion's stinger found its mark. Orion died in agony from the venom, his mortal body unable to withstand its power. Artemis, devastated by the loss, placed Orion among the stars as a constellation, immortalizing her hunting companion forever. But she also placed the scorpion in the heavens as Scorpio, positioned so that as one constellation rises, the other sets. Even in death, Orion flees the scorpion across the sky, and even as a constellation, the hunter remains hunted. Another version tells a darker story of divine manipulation. In this tale, Apollo grew increasingly concerned about his sister's relationship with Orion. Perhaps he feared she would break her vow of virginity and marry the mortal hunter. Perhaps he was simply jealous of the time and attention Artemis devoted to Orion. Perhaps he saw in their relationship a threat to the natural order, a dangerous blurring of the boundary between God and mortal. Whatever his reasons, Apollo decided to intervene. One day, as Orion was swimming far out at sea, Apollo challenged his sister to a contest of archery. He pointed to a dark spot in the water, barely visible at such a distance, and bet that even Artemis's legendary accuracy could not hit such a tiny target. Artemis, her competitive nature aroused, accepted the challenge immediately. She drew her bow, sighted carefully, and loosed her arrow with all her divine precision. The arrow flew true and struck the target perfectly. Only as she walked down to the beach to confirm her victory did Artemis realize what she had done. The waves carried Orion's body to shore, her arrow protruding from his head. Apollo had tricked her into killing her own beloved hunting companion. The grief that overwhelmed Artemis in this version was compounded by rage. At Apollo for his deception, at herself for being deceived, at the cruelty of fate that had turned her own skill against the one person she had cared for. She tried to revive Orion, called upon Asclepius the god of healing to restore him to life. But Zeus forbade it. The dead must remain dead, mortal and immortal alike. All Artemis could do was place Orion in the stars, creating a memorial that would last forever, ensuring that his memory would not be erased by time. A third version paints Orion in a less sympathetic light. In this telling, Orion's character was flawed from the beginning. Yes, he was a skilled hunter and initially charmed Artemis with his abilities, but he was also reckless, boastful, and ultimately predatory not just toward animals but toward women. He attempted to assault one of Artemis's nymphs, in some versions Opis, in others one of the Pleiades, or perhaps he even attempted to force himself upon Artemis herself. In this version, there is no tragedy, no accident, no divine manipulation. There's only justice. Artemis shot Orion deliberately, punishing him for his attempted violation of her sacred companions or herself. The arrow flew straight and true, as her arrows always did, and Orion died knowing exactly why his life was being taken. This version makes Artemis's placement of Orion among the stars less a gesture of mourning and more a warning. This is what happens to those who mistake the goddess's favor for weakness, who interpret her companionship as an invitation for something more. Yet another version involves Eos, the goddess of the dawn, who fell in love with Orion herself, jealous of the time Orion spent with Artemis, or simply wanting the handsome hunter for herself. Eos carried him away. Artemis, furious at this theft, shot Orion down with one of her arrows. In this telling, the killing is an act of possessiveness, of refusing to share what she considered hers, even if she could not or would not claim him in any conventional sense. The proliferation of different versions of Orion's death suggests how uncomfortable ancient Greeks were with the idea of Artemis in love. Each version seems to be attempting to reconcile the goddess's well-established character as eternal virgin with evidence of a genuine relationship with Orion. Some versions deny the relationship altogether, making Orion just another victim of Artemis's wrath. Others acknowledge the relationship, but show it ending through accident or manipulation rather than Artemis's choice. None of the versions allow for a happy ending, for the simple reason that such an ending would fundamentally change who Artemis was. What makes the Orion story particularly poignant is the sense of loss that pervades even the versions where Artemis kills him deliberately. Creating the constellation was not merely about memorializing a fallen companion. It was about keeping Orion close, ensuring that she could see him every night when she drove the moon across the sky, maintaining a connection that transcended death. The constellation of Orion is one of the most recognizable in the sky, visible throughout the world, impossible to miss. Artemis made sure that Orion would never be forgotten, never fade into obscurity, never be lost to time. Some ancient sources suggest that Artemis mourned Orion more deeply, and for longer than she had mourned anyone or anything else in her eternal existence. The loss changed her, made her more withdrawn, more fierce, more absolute in her insistence on maintaining the boundaries she had established. If she had ever been tempted to break her vow of virginity, Orion's death ended that temptation forever. Better to remain alone, invulnerable, untouched, than to risk such pain again. The story raises profound questions about love and identity. Could Artemis have loved Orion while maintaining her essential nature as the virgin goddess? Was their relationship necessarily doomed? by who and what she was? Or might there have been a way for them to continue their companionship without Artemis abandoning her core identity? These questions haunt the myth, giving it a melancholic quality that sets it apart from most Greek divine mortal relationships, which typically end in death or transformation, but rarely in genuine tragedy. What we can say with certainty is that Orion mattered to Artemis in a way that no one else did. Whether as friend, companion, almost lover, or cautionary tale, he occupied a unique position in her mythology. The constellation bearing his name serves as both memorial and warning, a reminder of what Artemis lost and of why she would never allow herself to be vulnerable to such loss again. Every night, as the stars wheel overhead, the goddess who swore to belong to no one and to need no one sees the image of the one mortal who came closest to changing her mind, forever frozen in the heavens, forever hunting, forever just out of reach. The paradox, virgin goddess of childbirth. Perhaps no aspect of Artemis is more paradoxical than her role as a goddess of childbirth. How could the virgin goddess, who swore never to marry, never to bear children, never even to engage in sexual activity, become one of the primary deities to whom women in labor prayed? How could someone with no personal experience of pregnancy or motherhood be trusted to guide women through one of life's most dangerous and transformative experiences? The answer lies in Artemis's own birth story and in ancient Greek understanding of what childbirth required. So as we discussed earlier, Artemis was born first on Delos, and immediately after her own birth, she helped her mother Leto deliver Apollo. She was, quite literally, present at her twin brother's birth, assisting in the delivery even as a newborn goddess herself. This paradoxical image of a baby serving as midwife captures something essential about Artemis's relationship to childbirth. She understood its dangers and difficulties, not from experience of being pregnant, but from experience of witnessing birth from the very beginning of her own existence. Moreover, childbirth in the ancient world was not merely a physical event, but a spiritual one, fraught with danger and requiring divine assistance. Women died in childbirth regularly. Babies died before, during, and after birth. The process was painful, dangerous, unpredictable. In a world without modern medicine, women facing labor were literally risking their lives to bring forth new life. They needed all the divine help they could get. Artemis, as a virgin goddess, represented a particular kind of power over childbirth. She was not caught up in the cycle of pregnancy and birth herself. She was not weakened or made vulnerable by it. She could approach childbirth from a position of strength, wielding her divine power to ease suffering and prevent death without being compromised or diminished by the process. Her virginity was, in this context, a source of strength rather than weakness, a concentration of vital force that she could direct toward helping others rather than being depleted by her own reproductive activities. The goddess worked closely with Aletheia, who was specifically dedicated to the moment of delivery, to the pushing and birthing process itself. But Artemis's role was broader, encompassing the entire experience of pregnancy and the postpartum period as well. She was invoked during pregnancy to ensure the health of mother and child. She was called upon during difficult labors to ease pain and speed delivery. She was honored after successful births with offerings of clothing, particularly the garments women had worn during pregnancy and labor. These clothing dedications were common throughout the classical period, with women leaving their garments at Artemis's temples in gratitude for successful deliveries. But Artemis's relationship to childbirth had a darker aspect as well. Deaths in childbirth were attributed to her arrows. When a woman died during labor, it was said that Artemis had shot her with one of her painless, death-bringing arrows. This was not necessarily punishment. Often it was seen as Artemis bringing a merciful, quick death to women who would otherwise suffer prolonged agony. The goddess's arrows could kill swiftly and cleanly, without the drawn-out suffering that complications in childbirth could cause. This dual role, as both helper and potential killer, made Artemis a goddess to be carefully honored by pregnant women. Her favor could mean an easy birth, but her wrath or even her mere indifference could mean death. Women made offerings, prayed fervently, and performed rituals to ensure Artemis would look favorably upon their labors. The goddess was also deeply concerned with the welfare of children once they were born. She was kurotrophic, a child-nurturing deity, with particular attention to young girls. From infancy through adolescence, girls were under Artemis's special protection. She watched over them, guarded them from harm, guided them through the dangerous transition from childhood to womanhood. This protective role extended beyond just physical safety to encompass their development into adulthood and their preparation for their future lives. At sites like Brauron in Attica, girls between the ages of 5 and 10 participated in rituals dedicated to Artemis. The most famous of these was the archetype, or acting the bear ceremony. Girls would wear saffron-colored robes and engage in ritual activities that included dancing, racing, and other performances. The exact nature and meaning of these rituals is debated, but they seem to have been part of the transition from childhood to adolescence, preparing girls for puberty and eventual womanhood. The bear connection is significant and multifaceted. Bears were sacred to Artemis, known for being fierce mothers who protected their cubs with deadly force. The she-bear embodied the protective maternal instinct that Artemis herself represented, despite her own perpetual virginity. By acting the bear, girls symbolically took on some of that fierce, protective energy, learning to value and defend themselves and their future children. These ceremonies also served as a kind of atonement. One myth tells of a bear sacred to Artemis that was killed at Brauron after it scratched a young girl. The goddess sent a plague in retaliation, and the community was told that young girls must act as bears to appease Artemis's wrath. This story frames the archetype as both punishment and protection. The girls must perform the ritual to maintain Artemis's favor and ensure she continues to watch over them, rather than directing her wrath toward them. Artemis's role as protector of young girls had a particularly poignant aspect in ancient Greece, where girls faced specific dangers and vulnerabilities. They were at risk of early death from disease, at risk of being married off to much older men at very young ages, at risk of dying in their first childbirth. By placing themselves under Artemis's protection, girls and their families were seeking divine intervention to help them survive these dangers and transition successfully into adulthood. The goddess's temples and sanctuaries became places where young girls could exist in a kind of protected space. temporarily freed from the immediate pressures of marriage and domesticity. At Brauron, for instance, girls served Artemis for periods of time, living in the sanctuary, learning the goddess's rituals, and experiencing a form of female community centered around something other than domestic life. This may have been some girls' only experience of independence and autonomy before they were married. There's a deep irony in the fact that Artemis, who rejected marriage and motherhood for herself, was the primary divine protector for girls who would almost certainly grow up to become wives and mothers. But perhaps this irony is precisely the point. Artemis represented a path not taken, a road not traveled. She embodied possibilities that most mortal women could never realize. The possibility of remaining unmarried, of maintaining independence, of defining oneself outside the roles of wife and mother. By worshiping Artemis, by performing rituals in her honor, girls could imagine, even if only temporarily, a different kind of life. They could experience, through their goddess, what freedom and autonomy felt like, even if their own futures held little of either. Artemis's involvement in childbirth also connected her to the cycle of life and death in profound ways. She, who had never given birth, was nonetheless intimately involved in bringing life into the world. She, who was a killer of beasts and humans alike, was also a protector of the most vulnerable human lives. She represented both the beginning of life and its potential end, both the hope of safe delivery and the fear of death in childbirth. This duality extended throughout her various roles. She was virgin, but involved in fertility. She was a killer, but a protector. She was wild, but concerned with civilization's most domestic moments. She was of the wilderness, but present in homes and birthing rooms. These paradoxes were not contradictions, but rather reflected the complex reality of women's lives in the ancient world, where they might be powerful in some contexts and powerless in others, where they were both creators of life and vulnerable to death, where they existed simultaneously in wild nature and civilized society. When ancient Greek women prayed to Artemis during pregnancy and labor, they were not simply calling on a goddess of childbirth in any simple sense. They were calling on the power of virginity, of concentrated female force undiluted by male influence. They were calling on the fierce, protective instinct of the mother bear defending her cubs. They were calling on the precision and efficiency of the huntress who kills cleanly and quickly. They were calling on the goddess who understood suffering, who had witnessed her own mother's 9 days of labor, who knew intimately what pain and danger childbirth involved. And most profoundly, they were calling on the goddess who represented everything they could not be: the free woman, the independent woman, the woman who belonged to herself alone. In their moment of greatest vulnerability, as they risked their lives to bring forth new life, they invoked the one who had never been vulnerable in that particular way, hoping that some of her invulnerability, some of her strength, some of her concentrated power would flow to them in their need. Temples, cults, and sacred worship. The worship of Artemis extended throughout the ancient Greek world and beyond, with temples, sanctuaries, and cult sites dedicated to her in locations ranging from remote mountain shrines to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Each site reflected different aspects of the goddess, different local traditions, different understandings of who Artemis was and what she represented. Together, they painted a picture of a goddess whose influence was pervasive and whose worship was deeply meaningful to diverse communities. The most famous temple dedicated to Artemis was the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, located in what is now Turkey. This magnificent structure, rebuilt multiple times across centuries, was considered one of the architectural marvels of the ancient world. The temple was enormous, 425 feet long and 225 feet wide, with 127 columns, each standing 60 feet high. It took over 120 years to build in its most famous iteration, and its grandeur attracted pilgrims from across the Mediterranean world. But the Artemis worshipped at Ephesus was somewhat different from the huntress of Greek mythology. The cult statue showed her with multiple protrusions on her chest, often interpreted as either multiple breasts or possibly bull testicles, symbolizing abundant fertility. This Artemis Ephesia was more closely connected to ancient Anatolian mother goddesses than to the virgin huntress of Greek tradition. She represented fertility, abundance, and the generative power of nature in ways that seemed to contradict her role as eternal virgin. This apparent contradiction reveals how Artemis absorbed and incorporated characteristics of local goddesses as Greek culture spread. The worship at Ephesus likely predated Greek colonization, devoted to an indigenous deity who was later identified with Artemis as the Greeks became dominant in the region. Rather than replacing the local goddess entirely, the Greeks merged her with their own Artemis, creating a hybrid deity who combined elements of both traditions. The temple at Ephesus was served by eunuch priests and virgin priestesses, maintaining both male and female sacred personnel. The eunuch priests, called megabizi, had deliberately castrated themselves in service to the goddess, perhaps reflecting the temple's inheritance from older cults that included this practice. The virgin priestesses, following Artemis's own example, dedicated themselves to her service, foregoing marriage and childbirth to serve the goddess who had similarly forsworn these things. The temple attracted massive numbers of pilgrims and became a center of economic activity. Artisans produced small replica statues of Artemis for sale to visitors, a practice so lucrative that it sparked a riot when early Christian missionaries began converting Ephesians and threatening the temple's economic importance. This riot, described in the New Testament book of Acts, showed how deeply the worship of Artemis was embedded, not just in religious life, but in the economic and social fabric of Ephesian society. In mainland Greece, one of the most important cult sites was at Brauron in Attica, the location of the Archetype rituals we discussed earlier. The sanctuary at Brauron focused particularly on Artemis's role as protector of young girls and women in childbirth. Archaeological excavations have revealed extensive dedicatory offerings, including vast quantities of clothing, the garments left by women after successful childbirth, as well as children's clothing left as offerings for Artemis's protection. The temple complex at Brauron included residential areas where young girls serving the goddess would stay during their period of service. There was also a sacred spring, essential for many of Artemis's cult sites, reflecting her association with water and with the life-giving properties of springs and streams. The rituals at Brauron were specifically feminine, creating a space where women and girls could gather under Artemis's protection, temporarily freed from male authority and supervision. Another major cult center was in Sparta, where Artemis was worshipped as Artemis Orthia. This version of the goddess had decidedly martial characteristics, appropriate for the militaristic Spartan society. Young Spartan boys underwent brutal tests of endurance at her sanctuary, including competitions in which they were whipped to see who could endure the most pain without crying out. This ritual, while shocking to modern sensibilities, was seen as training in the courage and endurance that Spartan warriors required. The worship of Artemis Orthia also included the dedication of sickle-shaped votive offerings, possibly representing the crescent moon with which Artemis was associated. The sanctuary's archaeological remains show continuous worship from the Archaic period through the Roman era, demonstrating the enduring importance of Artemis in Spartan religious life. At Patras in Achaea, Artemis was worshipped as Artemis Laphria with spectacular annual festivals. The most notable ritual was a massive fire ceremony in which live animals were thrown into a great pyre as offerings to the goddess. Birds, deer, young wolves, young bears, and various other animals were sacrificed in this way. The ritual was both a demonstration of the goddess's dominion over all wild creatures and a dramatic, visceral reminder of her power over life and death. The Temple of Artemis at Olympia was smaller but significant, particularly because of its location near the famous Olympic Games. Athletes would make offerings to Artemis, seeking her favor in the competitions, perhaps hoping that some of her hunting prowess and physical excellence would transfer to them in their own athletic endeavors. On the island of Delos, Artemis's birthplace, there were temples and rituals commemorating her birth and her assistance in delivering Apollo. The island was sacred to both twins, and the dual temples reflected their shared origins and their ongoing connection. Pilgrims came to Delos to honor the place where these powerful deities had entered the world, and to make offerings in gratitude for safe births or in hopes of future fertility. Mountains throughout Greece hosted sanctuaries and shrines to Artemis, often in remote locations, requiring difficult journeys to reach. These wilderness sanctuaries reflected Artemis's essential character as a goddess of wild places. Worshippers who made the trek to these mountain shrines were entering Artemis's own territory, the forests and peaks she preferred to civilized spaces. The journey itself was part of the worship, a pilgrimage that took devotees out of their normal lives and into the liminal spaces where the goddess dwelt. Ritual practices in Artemis worship varied by location but shared certain common elements. Animal sacrifice was central, particularly of deer and goats, though the specific animals varied by region and by what offering seemed most appropriate. Unlike some gods who demanded elaborate, expensive offerings, Artemis was often content with simpler gifts. A hunter might dedicate the first portion of game killed. A woman might leave clothing worn during childbirth. A young girl might offer a lock of hair cut before marriage. Music and dance featured prominently in Artemis worship. Ancient sources describe circular dances performed by groups of women and girls, moving in patterns that may have symbolized the movements of animals or the phases of the moon. These dances created moments of communitas, bringing worshippers together in shared physical expression of devotion to their goddess. The festivals of Artemis often included foot races, particularly for young girls and women. These races celebrated Artemis's own swiftness and physical prowess. while also providing one of the few socially acceptable contexts in which women could engage in public athletic competition. Winners received prizes and recognition, experiencing a brief moment of public acclaim similar to that enjoyed by male athletes. Processions were another common element, with worshippers carrying cult statues or sacred objects from one location to another, often from a temple in a city to a rural sanctuary. These processions marked the boundaries of Artemis's territory, reaffirmed the community's relationship with the goddess, and provided opportunities for public display of devotion. The worship of Artemis also had a significant political dimension, because she was concerned with the transition of girls into womanhood and with successful childbirth. She was essentially concerned with the continuation of the community. Honoring Artemis was a way of ensuring that future generations would be born healthy and that young girls would survive to become mothers themselves. City-states that wanted to grow and prosper needed Artemis's favor to ensure their population remained strong. Moreover, Artemis represented a kind of boundary between civilization and wilderness, between the domestic sphere and the wild. By maintaining her worship, communities acknowledged those boundaries and sought to maintain proper relationships with the forces beyond their walls. The goddess who could protect or threaten, who controlled wild animals and wild places, needed to be honored to ensure she directed her power favorably, rather than turning it against human settlements. The sanctuaries of Artemis often served as places of refuge as well. People fleeing persecution or violence could claim sanctuary in her temples, placing themselves under the goddess's protection. This practice recognized Artemis's role as protector of the vulnerable, particularly women and children who might be fleeing from violence or abuse. To violate the sanctuary of Artemis was to risk her terrible wrath, so these sacred spaces provided real practical protection, in addition to symbolic shelter. Legacy and modern resonance. The goddess Artemis did not fade with the decline of ancient Greek religion. She evolved, transformed, and continued to influence culture and imagination through the centuries, adapting to new contexts while retaining essential elements of her character. From her Roman identification with Diana through Renaissance art and literature to modern feminist reinterpretations, Artemis has remained a powerful and resonant figure. When the Romans encountered Greek religion, they engaged in a practice called Interpretatio Romana, identifying Greek deities with their own gods. Artemis was identified with Diana, a goddess who had likely originated independently in Italian religion, but who shared enough characteristics with Artemis to make the identification natural. Diana preserved most of Artemis's essential qualities. She was virgin goddess of the hunt, protector of women and children, associated with wild animals and wild places, often depicted with bow and arrows. But Diana also took on distinctively Roman characteristics, becoming particularly associated with the moon and with crossroads. The triple goddess Hecate, who in Greek tradition was separate from Artemis, became more closely merged with Diana in Roman religion, creating a Diana who ruled heaven, earth, and the underworld. This more cosmic Diana appeared in Roman art and literature as a more complex, more powerful figure than the Greek Artemis had been. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus continued to be a major pilgrimage site well into the Roman period, remaining economically and culturally important even as the Roman Empire expanded. The worship of Diana, Artemis proved remarkably durable, surviving longer than many other pagan practices, even as Christianity spread through the Roman world. With the rise of Christianity, pagan gods were not worshipped openly, but they were not forgotten either. They survived in various forms, in folk practices that secretly maintained older traditions, in literary references that preserved mythological knowledge, in artistic representations that kept their images alive. Artemis, Diana, appeared in medieval manuscripts, often as a symbol of chastity and purity, attributes that made her palatable to Christian morality, even as her pagan origins were acknowledged. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical mythology, and Artemis reappeared in art and literature with renewed vigor. Artists like Titian created stunning paintings depicting scenes from her mythology, Diana and Actaeon, Diana and Callisto, the death of Actaeon. These paintings explored themes of nakedness, violation, punishment, and transformation, with psychological depth that went beyond mere illustration of mythological stories. Renaissance and Baroque sculptures captured Artemis, Diana, as the huntress, often showing her with bow drawn, deer at her side, or in the moment of releasing an arrow. These works celebrated her physical beauty and athletic grace, presenting her as an ideal of female strength and independence at a time when such ideals were not commonly celebrated. In literature, Artemis appeared in works ranging from Shakespeare's plays to more obscure Renaissance poetry. She was invoked as a symbol of chastity, of female power, of nature's wildness. Characters might swear by Diana or call upon her for protection. Her mythology provided rich material for exploring themes of desire and denial, of power and vulnerability, of nature and civilization. The Romantic period, with its emphasis on nature and emotion, found Artemis particularly compelling. Poets celebrated her wildness, her independence, her rejection of social constraints. She became a symbol of everything that resisted civilization's ordering impulse, representing the sublime and terrible aspects of nature that romantic sensibility so valued. In the modern era, Artemis has been reclaimed by feminist movements as a symbol of female autonomy and resistance to patriarchal control. Her refusal to marry, her maintenance of her own space and her own rules, her fierce protection of her boundaries, her competence and skill in domains typically coded as masculine. All of these qualities resonate with contemporary struggles for women's independence and equality. Modern retellings of Greek mythology often focus on Artemis's story with renewed attention, examining the complexities and contradictions in her character. Writers explore what it means to be a virgin goddess in a world that constantly threatened female autonomy. They investigate the seemingly harsh punishment of figures like Callisto and Actaeon, asking what these stories reveal about ancient attitudes toward consent, boundaries, and justice. They examine the paradox of the virgin goddess of childbirth, finding in it insights about different forms of female power and different ways of relating to reproduction and motherhood. In popular culture, Artemis appears in various forms. The Percy Jackson series by Rick Riordan features her prominently, showing her leading a band of young hunters who have sworn themselves to her service, choosing Artemis's path of independence over conventional romance and marriage. This portrayal introduces a new generation, to Artemis while adapting her mythology for contemporary sensibilities, exploring what it might mean for modern young women to make similar choices. Television shows, movies, comic books, and video games draw on Artemis's imagery and mythology, sometimes faithfully and sometimes loosely. She appears as a character, as a source of inspiration for fictional characters, as a symbolic presence. Her bow, her connection to the moon, her association with hunting, her fierce independence. All of these elements prove endlessly adaptable to new contexts and new stories. The goddess has also found resonance in environmental movements. Artemis, as protector of wild animals and wild places, as representative of nature in its untamed state, speaks to contemporary concerns about ecological destruction and species extinction. She reminds us that wilderness has value beyond its utility to humans, that wild creatures have their own right to exist, that there are places that should remain outside human control and exploitation. Neo-pagan and Wiccan traditions have embraced Artemis as a goddess still worthy of worship. Modern practitioners create rituals honoring her, build altars in her name, call upon her for protection and guidance. These contemporary worshippers may not believe in Artemis in the same literal way ancient Greeks did, but they find in her mythology and symbolism something powerful and meaningful for their own spiritual lives. Academic scholarship continues to explore Artemis from various angles: anthropological, archaeological, literary, art historical, feminist. Each approach reveals new facets of the goddess, new understandings of what she meant to ancient peoples and what she might mean to us. Excavations at her temple sites provide material evidence of how she was worshipped. Studies of her mythology reveal patterns and meanings that earlier scholars missed. Comparative work shows how Artemis relates to similar goddesses in other cultures, suggesting deep roots that predate even the ancient Greeks. What makes Artemis so enduringly compelling is her fundamental independence. In a world still struggling with questions of female autonomy, with issues of consent and boundaries, with tensions between nature and civilization, Artemis offers a powerful alternative vision. She is not defined by relationship to men. She is not constrained by social expectations. She refuses to be diminished, controlled, or possessed. She claims her own space, sets her own rules, and enforces those rules with swift and terrible consequences for those who violate them. At the same time, Artemis's fierceness is balanced by her protective nature. She defends the vulnerable, women in childbirth, young children, wild animals. She shows that strength does not require cruelty, that independence does not mean isolation, that power can be used to protect rather than to dominate. If in her mythology we see both the necessity of strong boundaries and the importance of fierce care, Artemis also reminds us of the value of wild places and wild things. In an increasingly urbanized, technological, controlled world, the goddess of the wilderness stands as testament to what we lose when we tame and order everything. She represents possibilities that lie outside human systems, mysteries that resist explanation, powers that cannot be contained. She is both warning and promise, warning of what happens when we forget our place in nature, promise that wildness still exists and can still be accessed by those who seek it out. The contradictions in Artemis: virgin and childbirth goddess, fierce killer and tender protector, wild and civilized, independent and deeply connected to family and followers, reflect the complex realities of existence. She shows us that we need not be simple or consistent, that apparent contradictions can coexist within a single identity, that complexity is not weakness but rather reflects the fullness of being. As we look to the future, Artemis seems unlikely to fade from a cultural memory or lose her relevance. The issues she embodies, female autonomy, the relationship between humanity and nature, the necessity of boundaries, the power of independence, the value of protection, remain pressing concerns. New generations will continue to discover her mythology and find in it meaning for their own lives and struggles. And so we reach the end of our journey through the forests and mountains where Artemis reigns eternal. We have followed her from birth on Delos to her placement of Orion among the stars. We have witnessed her fierce protection of her autonomy, her terrible vengeance against those who violated her boundaries, her complex relationship with love and loss. We have explored the paradox of the virgin goddess of childbirth, the huntress who protected as fiercely as she killed, the wild goddess who shaped civilized life through her influence over transitions and generations. Artemis remains one of the most compelling figures in Greek mythology precisely because she refuses simple categorization. She is too complex to be reduced to a single attribute, too fierce to be domesticated, too powerful to be contained. She stands as testament to possibilities that lie outside conventional expectations, to forms of female power that require no male validation or participation, to the enduring value of wildness in both nature and spirit. Whether we encounter her as virgin goddess or childbirth deity, as huntress or moon goddess, as fierce avenger or tender protector, Artemis challenges us to consider what freedom truly means, what independence requires, what strength looks like when it is not defined by domination, but by sovereignty over one's own existence. If you found value in this exploration of Artemis and her mythology, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Mythos Deep Dive. Your support allows us to continue bringing you comprehensive, well-researched explorations of the ancient stories that continue to shape our world. Share this video with others who might find fascination in the fierce goddess of the hunt and the wilderness. And leave a comment telling us which Greek deity or mythological story you'd like us to explore next. Until then, may you walk safely through both wild places and civilized spaces, protected by the knowledge that somewhere in the eternal forests, Artemis continues her hunt, her bow always ready, her arrows always true.